Okay, we ready? Okay. Thank you all so much for joining this event, guys. I really appreciate it. It means so much to me, and I know that it means so much to the rest of the executive board. I appreciate all of you for tuning in. First, I just kind of want to introduce, if you don't know exactly what Turning Point is, we're a nonprofit club on campus. We're one of the largest on campus, and we host great events just like this one. We are partnering with LI, or the Leadership Institute, for this event, so we thank them so much for bringing in Gabriel and bringing in Dr. Rechtenwald, so we appreciate them. We thank them for their help and their support throughout all of this. I just want to say that after this event, immediately following this event, we are still going to be having a book signing with Gabriel. He is going to be on the Montview steps, so if you want to come out to that event, he will be there. You will be able to introduce yourself, get a book signed, stuff like that. We are giving away around 10 books to students, so make sure you're there early to get a book. So I pray, I thank you all so much for joining. First, we're going to kind of do Dr. Rechtenwald. He's going to be speaking, and if you don't know who Dr. Rechtenwald is, he is a former NYU professor who actually got fired from NYU for teaching against critical race theory. He was actually a Marxist whenever he was a professor, and then he became disillusioned from those beliefs and started a Twitter page called the Antifa Professor, and he was kind of pushed out of his job after that. So we thank him so much for joining. We appreciate him being willing to sit down and actually talk to you guys. So he's going to speak first, and then after he speaks, he is going to be doing a short Q&A, and then after he's done, we'll reintroduce Gabriel. Gabriel, like I said, is a former Antifa member. He's a great guy, super awesome. It's going to be a great time. I appreciate you guys so much for tuning in once again, and I hope you guys enjoy the event. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks so much.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Does everybody hear me? Okay, I'm going to be speaking to you about the Confucius Institutes. And the title of my talk is Confucius Institutes and Ideological Subversion. So we should note, first of all, that China has a very great zest for global power. Their motto is, for foreign relations, make the foreign serve China. This is part of their Communist Party's United Front Work Department, the controlling agency that controls China's efforts to increase power around the world. And this ambition has been too often realized. So we must understand Confucius Institutes as in the context of China's broader global goals for establishing power. So this follows under other types of initiatives that China undertakes, like the One Belt, One Road initiative, under which China offers large loans and grants to other governments for the development of infrastructure, and then makes these countries beholden to them. And in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, they gave them a huge loan for a port. And when the country of Sri Lanka defaulted on the loan, then China basically took over the port and moved in their navy. This is very typical. China's plan is on its plans for domination and ambition is also on display in the South China Sea, where they're creating artificial islands to host military defenses while claiming international waters as their own. And then there's the educational front. And this brings me to the Confucius Institutes. The Confucius Institutes are funded by the Chinese government. They offer these very highly curated, censored lessons in Chinese language and culture using textbooks and teachers chosen and paid for by the Chinese government. They provide China a backdoor access to monitor the opinions and teaching of American professors and to pressure universities to kowtow to China's prerogatives and narratives, while the Chinese emissaries keep an eye out for useful information and technology. The Confucius Institutes are located at colleges and universities. Inside of these colleges and universities, they're underwritten by the Chinese government. They're established in partnership with this agency called the Chinese Ministry of Education, which is part of the Chinese Languages and Council International, better known as Hanban. Hanban runs these foreign endeavors, as they call them, in these institutions throughout the United States. I count today 47 operative Chinese Communist Confucius institutes operating in universities in the United States. The Hanan partners with they have a partner institute in China, which partners with the university or college in the United States. They generally fund these Confucius institutes with an initial grant of $150,000, followed by a budget of $100,000 a year. This is supposed to be matched by the host institution, but generally those matching funds only come in the form of free classrooms. So this is a cheap way for universities to sponsor or to have Chinese language instruction and culture instruction in the United States without paying really anything. By 2017, 103 Confucius Institutes had been established in the US. Yet as of this talk, I count 51 total institutes in operation who have not planned on closing in 2021. There are a handful of others that have scrubbed their Confucius Institute pages from their websites. Of these 51, 47 operate in US colleges and universities. 3 of the 4 others are K through 12 or adult education. Many of these CIs, as they're called for short, offer credit-bearing courses in the Chinese culture and language. And these courses cost the institution nothing in terms of teacher salaries, which are paid by the Hanan. Where the teachers are concerned, the CIs are predominantly staffed and funded by Hanban. By 2017, Hanban also operated Confucius classrooms at 501 primary and secondary schools in the United States. In 2017, these 604 educational outposts comprised the majority of China's 1,579 Confucius institutes around the world. But these institutes gladly have attracted some scrutiny from the press, from the public, and finally from the state, from the federal government, and from local governments. The stories that have been told attest to the fact that these institutes do not allow intellectual freedom, freedom of inquiry, freedom of speech, and they don't hire their teachers on the basis of merit, but rather on the basis of their loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party. These US educational institutes send over also full tuition paying Chinese students, which is a big incentive for the universities and colleges to accept these Confucius institutes, because they get also full paying students who come to the United States and then are spied upon by these Confucius institutes. This is one of the things that is one of the major concerns, is that these institutes are used to spy on students, that is Chinese students. Now, these institutes, as it has been said, basically represent a Trojan horse. They look benevolent on the outside, but within they're housing the means for infiltrating US education in order to spread Chinese communist propaganda, to surveil on Chinese nationals, and even to engage in espionage. So there's been a great deal of concern. In 2009, Li Cheng, then the head of propaganda for the Chinese Communist Party and a party member of the Politburo, Standing Committee called Confucius Institutes, quote, an important part of Chinese overseas propaganda setup. So they admit this is a propaganda organ at home, they do. So they operate in relative secrecy. The agreements with the US institutions are hidden. Nobody has seen them except for the signatories of these contracts. And this is even the case in the case of public institutions. They're hiding the contracts from their respective states and legislators. But try as they might, China's leaders have not relieved Western anxieties about the institutes, that they teach political lessons that falsely represent China and thus influence generations of Americans and others to ensure friendly reception for China and its objectives in government and elsewhere. Now, by 2017, however, the tide began to turn against the Confucius Institutes, leading to the dramatic decrease in CIs and CCs operating throughout the country. For one, the National Association of Scholars, a conservative academic watchdog organization, released a scathing report entitled Outsourced to China. The report, authored by Rochelle Patterson, represented the findings of the NAS's investigations into the 12 Confucius Institutes that were operating in New York and New Jersey at the time. Then there was a documentary released called In the Name of Confucius by the Canadian filmmaker Doris Liu, and this began circulating. And it was her film was the culmination of a 3-year investigation into the practices and influence of the Confucius Institutes in North America, primarily in Ontario. These two events, the film and the report by the National Association of Scholars, set in motion a chain of events that have finally led to closure after closure of Confucius Institutes. Then bills being introduced into Congress, then a bill being passed, hundreds of articles being written, and major national focus finally centering on the need to ward off the untoward advances of the Chinese government into American higher education. So basically, as of today, we have seen the elimination of 50%, roughly, of the Confucius Institutes in the United States. But there are still problems on the horizon. The problems of the institutes, first of all, are intellectual freedom, their non-transparency, their lack of their entanglements with the institutions with which they're hosted, where they're hosted in the United States, these complex relationships which see Chinese students coming to the US paying full tuition, but also Chinese American students and professors being sent on trips to China at China's expense for so-called research. Basically, they do this to placate and to, seduce these Chinese, professors of Chinese literature and culture to turn a blind eye to China's doings in the United States in the Confucius Institutes. One of the things that these institutes avoid were all discussions, for example, of Taiwan, which China claims as its province, but it's an independent nation. Anything to do with Tibet, this is completely censored. The teachers are not allowed to speak about it in any negative way. The Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, and that is also off the table. And the practice of Falun Gong, which is a spiritual practice developed in China, which is basically a religious movement. And the Chinese government has made this religion utterly illegal. Now we know that they also are very, very, very censorious about all religious activity. They don't want any competition with the state's official ideology, which is communism, Marxist communism. they are very, 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 very circumspect and concerned about letting their teachers say anything about these issues. There was a Chinese national, a Confucius Institute teacher and Falun Gong practicer who taught at McMaster University in Canada, and she quit after a year at the Confucius Institute and sought asylum in Canada. She lodged a human rights complaint against the Confucius Institute, citing her employment contract, which prohibited employees from engaging in illegal activity, including belonging to the Falun Gong movement. When she signed the contract, she agreed to not be a member of Falun Gong, but she did so because she wanted to be able to get freedom and come to North America in order to practice freely without without the state intervening as they do in China. So she signed the contract in hopes to be afforded religious freedom in Canada, but she learned that the Confucius Institute was very censorious and very, very prohibitive of her practicing or anyone practicing or even mentioning Falun Gong. So these topics are utterly off the table. She basically won the discrimination case and was forced McMaster University in Ontario, Canada, to close its Confucius Institute in 2013. This is featured in the film In the Name of Confucius. But the NAS, the National Association of Scholars, was not the first organization to criticize Confucius Institutes. The American Association of University Professors, which represents American professors and their interest in the United States, cited infringements of academic freedom of professors, the violation of shared governance policies, and the loss of institutional autonomy as among the chief concerns that they had with Confucius Institutes. They wrote a statement entitled "On Partnerships with Foreign Governments, the Case of Confucius Institutes," and basically said this, quote, "Confucius Institutes function as an arm of the Chinese state and are allowed to ignore academic freedom. Their academic activities are under supervision of the Hanban, a Chinese state agency which is chaired by a member of the Politburo and the vice premier of the People's Republic of China. Most agreements establishing Confucius Institutes feature non-disclosure clauses and unacceptable concessions to the political aims and practices of the government of China. Specifically, North American universities permit Confucius institutes to advance a state agenda in the recruitment and control of academic staff, that is, professors, in the choice of curriculum and in the restriction of debate. However, like many declarations from the American Association of University Professors, this one went largely ignored by the colleges and universities in the United States. It wasn't until the pressure came from the National Association of Scholars and eventually state and federal legislatures and the FBI that these institutions began to take note. As I said, their contracts are, there's no transparency, there's entanglements, and then there's the question of soft power. Soft power is power that is exerted by ingratiating yourself, a nation ingratiating itself to a host nation. Confucius Institutes present China in this positive light only, and they focus only on the innocuous aspects of Chinese culture, avoiding Chinese political history and human rights abuses, presenting Taiwan and Tibet as undisputed territories of China, and producing a generation of American students with very selective knowledge of a major country. So we can say that, however, there's been a great deal of movement here in terms of these Confucius Institutes. The good news is that a number of these institutes, as I said, have disappeared, roughly 50%. The bad news is that Confucius Institutes continue to operate, and Democratic lawmakers now in control of both houses and the presidency apparently have no intention of doing anything about them. Buried in the miscellaneous, quote, other matters section of the National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA, for fiscal year 2021, the proposed restrictions on CIs had read as follows. An institution of higher education or other post-secondary educational institution shall not be eligible to receive federal funds from the Department of Education or other Department of Education funds that are provided directly to students unless the institutions ensure that any contract or agreement between the institution and the Confucius Institutes includes clear provisions that, 1, protect academic freedom at the institution, 2, prohibit the application of any foreign law on any campus of the institution, and 3, grant full managerial authority of the Confucius Institute to the institution, including full control over what is being taught, the activities carried out, the research grants that are made, and who is employed at the Confucius Institute. While these provisions represented a good start, they did not go nearly far enough to stop the CIs in their efforts. But even this meager provision will not be put in place. In January of this year, House Democrats removed the measure from the final version of the bill following negotiations. Thus, the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, contains no measures aimed at containing Confucius Institutes at all. Louisiana Senator John Kennedy, Republican, who helped write the Anti-Confucius Institute measure, said Democrats led by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi have gutted a key weapon to counter Chinese influence in academia. What's more, just weeks ago, Democrats on the House Education and Labor Committee blocked a budget amendment from Elise Stefanik, Republican from New York, that would have barred federal funds from U.S. schools that host Confucius Institutes. Stefanik's proposed amendment came after the Biden administration withdrew a rule that required schools participating in certain federal programs to disclose ties with Confucius Institutes. The Stefanik proposal was advanced as an amendment to Biden's $1.9 trillion stimulus bill and aimed to prevent taxpayer dollars from making their way to institutions that have partnerships with entities owned by the Chinese government. The proposal would have barred institutions that partner with organizations, quote, owned or controlled directly or indirectly by the government of the People's Republic of China or organized under the laws of the People's Republic of China from receiving funds. The amendment was scrapped. President Biden has reversed all attempts by the Trump administration to curb the influence of CIs in the US, including striking a rule proposed by President Trump on December 31st, 2020, that would have required schools that are certified to have student and exchange visitor programs to disclose agreements with Confucius Institutes and classrooms, including partnerships and financial dealings. That was scrapped. The Biden administration has also ignored a US Senate report warning of the dangers posed by Confucius Institutes. And former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced in August of 2020 that the US had designated the Confucius Institute as a, quote, foreign mission of the People's Republic of China, characterizing it as an entity controlled by the communist government in Beijing that advances, quote, global propaganda and malign influence in the United States in campuses and K-12 classrooms. Given that this recommendation came from the Trump administration, it is clearly being ignored. Further danger is posed by the possibility that Confucius Institutes may merely rebrand and rename themselves and yet operate exactly as they have been operating under the control of the Chinese government. According to China's Global Times, the Hanban is renaming itself the Ministry of Education Center for Language Exchange and Cooperation. The new ministry will continue to operate as the Hanban had operated It will continue to train Chinese language teachers, supply textbooks, and conduct many of the functions necessary for running and overseeing Confucius Institutes. But the Hanban will create a separate organization, the Chinese International Education Foundation, which will fund and officially oversee the institutes. This extra layer of bureaucracy is no doubt intended as an obfuscation, but it will essentially make no difference for all practical purposes. Confucius Institutes will remain subject to the same restrictions and pressures to conform to Chinese government dictates. They will continue to fulfill the Chinese government's goals of maintaining outposts on American college campuses, where they can disseminate propaganda, conduct espionage, monitor overseas Chinese students, and advance the United Front's agenda, quote, make the foreign serve China. In the future, policymakers will be obliged to implement a much more subtle and discriminating approach. The Hanban asserts that it won't require Confucius Institutes to undergo name changes at colleges, but as the Confucius Institute itself, the brand itself is now considered a red flag to millions of Americans, most colleges will simply view this moment as an opportunity to rebrand and rename themselves. While some educational institutions may declare that they are closing their Confucius Institutes, they may surreptitiously transfer the bulk of their operations to a new but in reality identical China-funded institute. It will be tempting to try to unearth and then crack down on each Confucius Institute and any reincarnations of them. But China has become masterful at disguising its outposts. China engages in doublespeak as a matter of policy. It will endlessly mask Confucius Institute-like programs under the cloak of bureaucracy and innocuous monikers. We should continue to investigate and expose the means of China's interference in American higher education. But at the same time, we are obliged to protect American higher education with a thoroughly aggressive policy towards China. What do we need to do to end China's infiltration of our educational systems? First, higher education needs to engage in transparency. Current law requires colleges to disclose any contracts and gifts from foreign sources that exceed $250,000 a year. That threshold needs to be lowered, with $50,000 serving as the minimum. Gifts from certain nations, including China, should be subject to disclosure regardless of monetary value. We also need basic information detailing the source of foreign gifts. The Department of Education recently released updated guidance asking colleges and universities to report the names of any foreign government agencies that donate to them. But private foundations and individuals are permitted to remain anonymous. Once the newly created Chinese International Education Foundation, technically a nonprofit, issues its funding to Confucius Institutes, it will instantly enjoy anonymity as a foreign donor. U.S. colleges and universities will be required to report little more than the dollar amount and a country of origin. This should change by requiring that all money from any agency in China be reported, whether governmental or otherwise. Second, the Department of Education should be required to review any college or university that reports 200,000 more gifts or contracts that originate in China. Similarly, the department should demand detailed information, including copies of contracts and memoranda of understanding involving any partnerships funded by foundations in China. Third, we should strongly disincentivize colleges and universities from taking Chinese money. Any college or university that receives 250,000 or more from China, considered in an aggregate from all donors and contractors, should face a significant decrease in eligibility for federal funding. Additionally, for every $50,000 above $250,000 in Chinese donations or contracts, the college should be subjected immediately to a 10% decrease in federal funding, excluding federal aid to students. Eligibility for federal non-student aid should be revoked for the duration of 5 years for any university that receives $500,000 or more from any source in China, governmental or private, in 1 calendar year. China's outlook, however, is long-term, especially in the critical field of education. America needs to protect its colleges and universities before it's too late. Thank you. There are Confucius Institutes in classrooms. They're called Confucius classrooms in K through 12 education. They are also funded by the Chinese Communist government, and they likewise are. They're likewise completely. All the textbooks are provided by China, and all the education, the entire curriculum of Chinese language instruction in K through 12 throughout the United States in these many schools are completely controlled by China. So that's how the institutes pose a problem. Yep.
Yeah. All righty. What, we good? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that speech, Mr. Rechtenwald. Now we have a few questions for you brought to you by students and some of the executive board members and stuff like that. One of the first questions is, one of the fears that the Biden administration has is the weaker stance against China and the CCP. What fears do you think are the most valid when it comes to our current executive leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very clear that the Biden administration is extremely soft on China. What did they say about the Uyghurs, who are the Islamic peoples in Xinjiang, who are being put in concentration camps? Biden said that this was just a cultural difference. That they have different cultural norms. So torturing people and putting them in concentration camps for their religion is just a cultural difference. So we see that they're very weak on China, and things could get very, very ugly very fast with China's influence here in the United States under the Biden administration, indeed.
Next question brought to you by another student. How do you respond when people call you racist for your political views or other ideological views?
I just ignore it because it has no meaning at all. I have, you don't need to defend yourself because your political views cause somebody to call you a racist or a white supremacist or a Nazi. I've been called all these things: Nazi, white supremacist, racist. I'm not even going to say I don't have a racist bone in my body, but I don't. And this is just should run off your back like water off of a duck. It's really completely just a ruse to try to turn the argument into an ad hominem argument because they don't have an argument for what you're saying.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Another question is, how do we, as students or as other just regular people, fight back against the radicalization that has infiltrated college campuses in America today?
Well, that's the $1 million question. I've been doing a lot of thinking and working and writing on this for quite a while. First of all, there's a large. I mean, these institutions in the United States, as you know, they're completely taken over by left-wing ideologues, and therefore it is very difficult to penetrate them with any other kinds of views. It's necessary to, first of all, as a conservative or non-leftist, let's just put it that way, it's very important that you become very conversant in your own beliefs and have defenses for the points of view that these people are going to bring at you, to have counter arguments prepared, because and you'll generally win the argument because leftists don't have to argue anymore. They just call names. They have become so unpracticed in argumentation because they don't have to argue. Everybody agrees with them. So in their echo chambers. So I think the first thing I would say to students is become extremely well versed in the arguments by reading, by studying. You have to bone up on your work. You have to be better than them academically, scholarship-wise. And then I think it's going to take a tremendous pushback from the public. It's going to take exposure, as is happening, but it's going to take a great deal more of exposure to show how corrupt and how politically one-sided, completely, completely partisan and completely biased these institutions are. And as such, I think federal funding will be at risk for them. And I think that's probably one of the things that has to happen. The issue about federal funding has to be addressed, so that these places can't continue to be echo chambers as they are.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And the final question that we have for you, Mr. Rechtenwald, is what do you believe about the race relations or critical race theory being pushed upon our police force in America today?
It's dreadful, and they're doing it under the auspices of racial sensitivity training, but it's really critical race theory. And the main premise of critical race theory is that racism is systemic, and it's not restricted to individuals or institutions. It's just everywhere, and it informs everything in society. It's completely totalizing. There's no outside of race. There's nothing other than racism. I mean, racism informs every interaction, every institution, every social interaction, just about everything that happens on the face of the earth, according to critical race theory. So I think it's an abominable development that the police force are being trained in critical race theory instead of the classical liberal perspective, which is not liberal today, which is to treat other people as individuals, to treat everybody as individuals, not to judge people on the basis of their phenotypes, which is what we were trained to do and what we were taught, if we were taught well. That you don't judge people on the basis of their appearance or their group membership, but you treat each person as an individual and regard them in that way. That each person is sanctified, that each person has the rights that are accorded them, not by the state, but by God, frankly. So I think that this is a bad development, and it's going to have to be countered with better ideas.
We appreciate you coming on. I know I have enjoyed your speech. I know as well as the executive board members of Turning Point, and I know that the students have loved it. So I just want to say thank you to you. Thank you for being willing to take your time and come and speak. We appreciate you not only just speaking, but speaking up for college conservatives and different people like that feel like they are being silenced on college campuses. We appreciate you so much and everything that you're fighting for and everything that you're pushing for, not only just at NYU where you were, but around the world and around the nation as well. So we thank you again for just being willing to come and talk to all of us. So next up, we do have Gabriel Nadales. He is going to be, I guess, our starlight speaker. Gabriel is a former member of Antifa, as many of you know. He spent time in that, and he actually became disillusioned from those beliefs, and now is a conservative. So I want you guys to really be excited about what he has to say. And just a reminder that after this, there will be another little Q&A, so make sure that you comment your questions in the Q&A chat on here, or go to our Turning Point Instagram and ask them on our story, so that way you can have your questions directly answered by Gabriel. And thank you so much for you guys watching, Professor Michael. And now here is Gabriel. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You know, about 4 years ago, the mainstream left in the United States entered into a soft alliance with a radical faction known as Antifa. These two movements had very little in common, except for one thing. They both shared a hatred of President Donald Trump. This shared hatred then set the stage for 4 years of lies perpetuated by the left-wing mainstream media. In 2017, for example, when at UC Berkeley Antifa rioted, well, CNN claimed that Antifa was only trying to promote peace and inclusivity. In 2018, the Rolling Stone magazine wrote about how the Antifa platoon helped American forces defeat ISIS in Syria, while other journalists at the same time argued that Antifa had never before killed anyone. In 2019, CNN made a mini documentary series called The United States of Shade, in which the reporter, Kamau Bell, argued that, well, you know, Antifa, the Redneck Revolt, they're the good guys, when one of those same good guys that he interviewed bombed an ICE facility in Washington state, armed with multiple incendiary grenades and an assault rifle. And of course, in 2020, mere weeks after an Antifa terrorist gunned down a conservative voter in Portland, well, the New Yorker wrote an extensive piece called On the Streets with Antifa, in which again they promoted the lie that Antifa was only trying to protect communities from the so-called fascists. The mainstream left was willing to lie and to shield a truly despicable group in order to get rid of a president that they did not like. And unfortunately, they succeeded. You know, one of the problems with extremist and extremist groups is the fact that they don't see themselves as extremists at all. And in fact, one of the reasons that I joined the anti-fascist movement was because I believe I had the responsibility to fight for equality, just as every single one of you do. Yet, that conviction turned into a blindfold. Instead of preaching equality and understanding from one another, I promoted this dangerous us versus them mentality. And as such, it became easy for me to put on the black mask and participate in the fascist tactics of violence and intimidation. Antifa is a tumor in society that must be eradicated. But if we want a long-lasting recovery, we must work to stop the growth of extremist movements everywhere, because Antifa is only a symptom of this cancerous, self-righteous attitude that so many people have in modern society. And this good versus them mentality that Antifa has so graciously adopted is one of the greatest threats in American society today. So, I want to argue two things. First, I'm going to dispel the myth that Antifa is fighting anything good, because they're not. They're merely promoting this dangerous ideology. And of course, while I condemn violence from all sides of the political aisle, I offer my experience within the anti-fascist movement. And hopefully that will serve as a warning, especially to the mainstream left, to check who they're in bed with. But second, I want to impress upon every single one of you the importance of freedom of speech and tolerance of thought, because that is exactly what we need to heal in this country today. Just to accept one another, not as political opponents, but as just different people with different opinions. Now, the first thing I'm going to tell you is super simple, yet so many people get this wrong, and it is the fact that Antifa is not an organization. But at the same time, it's not just an idea like good old Joe Biden likes to say. No, the best way to understand Antifa is to see it as a movement. And within this movement, you have several different radical left-wing groups. Some of them call themselves Antifa, like Rose City Antifa, Philly Antifa, Sacramento Antifa, and many others. But some of them that don't call themselves Antifa would be like the Redneck Revolt, certain chapters of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Anarchist Black Cross, certain chapters of the IWW, the International Workers of the World, or in college campuses, groups like the By Any Means Necessary in Berkeley, or groups like the Young Democratic Socialists of America. I mean, this is not an exhaustive list by any standard, but it would be really hard to make one up because there's so many out there. In the end of the day, though, one thing that you truly need to understand is that you don't even have to put on a black mask in order for you to be part of the anti-fascist movement. Really, you just have to adopt two basic principles. The first one is that you have to adopt an anti-fascist mentality. And second, you must also be willing to enforce that mentality. Now, first, to adopt an anti-fascist mentality obviously means to reject everything that is fascism. But that begs the question, what in the world is fascism? Well, most Americans would believe fascism to be Nazi Germany or fascist communists such as Venezuela, China, and North Korea. To this radical left-wing group, everything that is fascism can be capitalism, freedom of speech, Judeo-Christian values, Western culture in general, because anything and everything that does not align with the left's radical agenda is fascist to Antifa. In fact, as an Antifa group said on its Twitter account in 2018, the fight against fascism will only be won when the capitalist system is smashed. And of course, they do mean smash because that's half the story. You must also be willing to enforce that mentality. And in fact, in the back of a book named Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook, which is honestly the Antifa Manifesto, which was written by a left-wing professor. This professor, Mark Bray, quotes a gentleman named Murray, who's a self-proclaimed Antifa activist. And Murray writes, well, you fight them by writing letters and making phone calls, so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists, so you don't have to fight them with knives. You fight them with knives, so you don't have to fight them with guns. And you fight them with guns, so you don't have to fight them with tanks. Now, some people claim that this is a form of anticipatory self-defense that can be boiled down to the phrase of, don't mess with me, and I won't mess with you. But there's absolutely no conditional threat to that statement. In fact, you can better say this in, you better sit down and shut up or we are going to make you by any means necessary. However, with this in mind, you can then break down Antifa activism into different stages. Of course, the first stage being intimidation. Then the second stage involves physical confrontation. Thereafter, it becomes deadly force, then organized deadly force until you reach the final stage, which is all-out warfare. Antifa has been in different stages of so-called activism throughout its entire history. And yet there's so many people out there who still believe the lie that Antifa has never before killed anyone, but it is just that. It is a lie. Because their body count is massive, especially when you consider the original Antifa group. The original group was named the Anti-Fascist Action, and it was established in Germany in the 1930s. But much like today, that Anti-Fascist Action was more interested in fighting for power than fighting actual Nazis, because this Anti-Fascist Action was the military wing of the KPD, the German Communist Party. And here, the KPD and the Anti-Fascist Action would team up with the Nazi Party of Germany to fight against other social democrats before Hitler rose to power. Additionally, that Anti-Fascist Action and the KPD were bankrolled by Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union. So here, the puppet master of the Anti-Fascist Action, who sent his external minister to the League of Nations to advocate for Antifa, had already murdered millions of people through his tyrannical socialist government. But even then, to be fair to modern Antifa, there's no direct connection between that Antifa and today's Antifa because they were wiped out after the Nazis. Yet it's the same way that modern neo-Nazis have no connection to the Nazi Party of Germany. Yet both modern groups are still promoting that hateful and dangerous ideology. But even then, we don't have to look that far to find modern Antifa killings. And in fact, in Italy, from a period of 1970 to 1988, the Red Brigade anti-fascist group killed dozens of people, including the Italian Prime Minister, Aldo Moro. In Spain, the 1st of October anti-fascist resistance groups killed 84 people from 1975 to 2007. And in fact, the name of this group, the 1st of October, is a celebration of the group's first attack in which they killed 4 police officers on the 1st of October. In Mexico, in 2011, the group Individuales Teniendo el Salvaje, or Individuals Tending to the Wild, took responsibility for killing a Mexican scientist and then bombing a laboratory, which injured several others. For decades, we were incredibly lucky that American Antifa had never been as destructive as some of its foreign counterparts. I think this is in part, to the fact that in America, it was in our culture to agree to disagree. But as we saw in 2020, left-wing radicals in the United States escalated their so-called activism to include attempted murder. And unfortunately, in more than one occasion, they have succeeded. In July, for example, Bernard Trammell, a Black conservative business owner who was shot in the head in front of his own business just for holding a political sign. Or Aaron Danielson in Portland, Oregon, who again was shot in the face by an Antifa terrorist. When I was involved in American Antifa, the worst things that I did was break some windows, spray paint, drop some banners, yell outside some guy's house to harass him. I'm incredibly lucky to have never hurt another person for a political purpose. And yet it should be self-evident to everybody that so-called Antifa activism is not activism at all. It is domestic terrorism. Now, I know that many of you must be really wanting to know two things. First of all, how did I get involved in the anti-fascist movement? And second, well, how did I leave? Well, the first time that I put on the black mask was in 2011, and it was to organize against the National Socialist Movement, which is a neo-Nazi group. Now, I still can't believe how they are. I mean, they proudly parade the swastika with an American flag as if the two could ever coexist in any world. But anyways, I went there just because I couldn't believe that there was neo-Nazis in my own community. And at this point, I already knew a little bit about Antifa, considering some of the music that I listened to. Modern Antifa actually comes from the 1980s in the anarcho-punk music, and I was into that music, so I knew a little bit about the history. So I decided to dress up in the black bloc and just see what I would find. Well, as soon as I went there, I met other anarchists, other members of the anti-fascist movement, and they took me in. They invited me to do more and more with them. I mean, and this is how it typically happens. Liberal activists are indoctrinated into doing more and more with the radical left that at some point I just couldn't believe what it was doing. And then when I protested the Nazis, actual Nazis, I believed that America stood with them. I mean, otherwise, why would the police defend the right to free speech? I mean, Antifa creates this false dichotomy that if you're not with them, all of a sudden you're part of the problem, you're a fascist. And of course, at the time, I didn't realize that it's not so simple. Things are not black and white. And in the United States, there are competing rights that we all must live with, because not doing so truly hurts our democracy and our republic. Yet, ultimately, I realized the error of my ways, and I became a conservative. But that all started in my senior year of high school when I was introduced to great economic minds like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell. Now, I call them great now, but let me tell you, at the time, I didn't like them. In fact, like I didn't really think much about them, but I found them interesting. Interesting enough that I wanted to talk to other people about it. Well, the only people who were interested in politics were my friends. Well, my friends were also members of the anti-fascist movement. Well, for being an anarchist at the time, that was the very first time that I was called a capitalist pig, just for asking questions. For several months after those conversations, I read a lot of left-wing books and talked to many other left-wing activists in a way to try to figure out how to disprove the free market. But instead, I found a lot of arguments by these people, a lot of strawman arguments by the left. And not only that, I kept finding people who just get annoyed, get mad at me for even asking these types of questions. So luckily, I started college, and I decided to start a libertarian club. Well, a lot of people find it incredibly interesting and just perplexing even that myself as a left-wing ideologue would start a libertarian club, a right-wing club. But this is actually a lot more common than you may think. I mean, in fact, I remember the first time that I did this speech. Right after I delivered my speech, whatever, there was this girl who told me she was a liberal, and she said, you know, the only reason I came is because a left-wing club on campus told me that you were going to spew a lot of anti-women propaganda. As you can tell, I don't talk about women's issues at all. Yet, fortunately, she came, and she heard my speech, and after the speech, she decided to join the club. Or another example, in Southern California, I was helping a Turning Point USA club recruit, and we're passing out buttons, the whole flyers, the whole deal, you know? And there's this girl who walked up to us and said, you guys are racist, you guys are fascists, insulting us in every way she possibly could. We didn't care. You know, I'm sure that many of you guys face students like this. And I remember she started walking away. And then 3 gentlemen were walking towards us. She said the same thing. Don't talk to them. They're racist. They're fascists. Well, you know something that caught their attention. They came up to us. And then I remember the main guy, he's like, well, why are you guys racist? Why are you guys fascists? As he picked up a little pin that said, big government sucks. And before I could even open my mouth, he was like, nah, man, you guys are cool. And he decided to sign up for the club. I mean, ultimately, I thought I was going to do the same. Because in college, I thought I was going to finally have the opportunity to talk to open-minded people from all sides of the political aisle. And boy, was I wrong. Because as soon as they found out that I was part of a libertarian club, the campus left showed their true colors. We lost our advisor numerous times. which is unfortunately a recurring problem that so many conservative students face. Our last advisor, he told us that he was threatened by the administrators, saying that if he wanted a future with the school, then, well, he would need to stop being our mentor. And unfortunately, that was not the only attempt to try to kick us out. In one incident, the administration threatened to sue me and my club for creating a parody of student government which involved a communist My Little Pony. After constant berating and intimidation and bias from different administrators and professors, we decided we finally had enough. We contacted the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, the FIRE, and we decided to file suit. I mean, it took a few painful months of us being harassed, even worse. And I mean, to this day, many of them, they still don't like us. In fact, the president of the school, I remember right before my graduation, there was this pre-graduation honor society like little event, and they were calling people who got a little award. Well, they called my name. The president of the school, she shook my hand and she said, "Well, we won't miss you." But we won. We won, and we removed their unconstitutional policies, and we sent a strong message to the school that they had absolutely no right to discriminate against conservative thought. And I mean, the reason that I left the anti-fascist movement is very simple. I just wanted to talk to people without being silenced. But the reason that I became a conservative was because I realized that the campus left was trying to silence dissent just the same. And yet, the Antifa problem stems from the fact that we have forgotten what it means to be a decent person, and we deny others the same rights that we demand. And we try to cast them aside as evil, and we try to cancel them. People willfully deafen themselves with this self-righteous ideology, and they refuse to empathize with the other side. And yet, I think we already have a cure to this disease. And it's not something new. It's not something that I came up with. It's something that we've been practicing for hundreds of years now, and it's called freedom of speech. When we look at one another or someone from the other side of the political aisle, we should not look at them as Republican or Democrat or as a liberal or as a conservative. We should look at one another as human beings who are entitled to an opinion, because partisanship divides nations. We need to put people first and politics second. I will tell you guys one last story which I think truly encompasses this idea. In 2020, CPAC had the opportunity to be interviewed by Joe Thomas. Joe Thomas is a radio show host from Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, I soon found out that he was involved in the Charlottesville riot. Not because he's a white supremacist, but because that's his hometown. He wanted to see what was going on so he could report it on his show, right? So as soon as he showed up, the Black Lives Matter movement and Antifa doused him with urine, pepper sprayed him, just because he was white. Well, at one point, there was this young gentleman, as he puts it, who was going to beat him down when Hawk Newsom stopped the attack. Now, Hawk Newsom is the leader of the Brooklyn Black Lives Matter movement. Why would a left-wing radical who has gone on Fox News and threatening to burn down this system, why would he defend a white Joe Thomas? Well, I also found out that Joe and Hawk had actually met a few months before that event, and at a different political event. And Joe interviewed Hawk. Well, about 10-15 minutes that interview lasted, well, they decided to start talking. Now, this is around the Trump election, so maybe you were thinking, oh, they're talking about President Trump, Hillary Clinton. No, they're talking about coffee and their children for over an hour. They saw each other not as political opponents or people from the other side of the aisle. They just saw themselves as just regular human beings with very intriguing lives, dislikes, and everything in between. It was that moment of humility in which Joe Thomas gave Hawk a voice, and then he just treated him as a decent person that ultimately saved Joe Thomas at Charlottesville. We need to listen before speaking. And when it comes to our own free speech, we need to be open and honest and respectful about our beliefs, because partisanship is evil. It divides nations. You know, in the Anti-Fascist Handbook, Mark Bray writes that at the heart of the anti-fascist outlook is a rejection of the classical liberal phrase that I disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Antifa actually believes in this fairy tale that with enough punches, they can shut down the alt-right. But whenever Antifa shuts down an event, whether they're Republican or actual fascist, then they're not winning. They're only creating a people who feel resentful and who are apt for radicalization. And if in fact, Antifa was correct and the people that they're trying to shut down were violent to begin with, then all you will see is escalation. And if the media continues to lie and defend the indefensible that is Antifa, well, those lies will only serve as a rallying cry for the extreme right, the alt-right, to increase their numbers, which will only serve as a call to action by Antifa, which again will only serve to get more people on the extreme right. Antifa and the alt-right, the extreme right, are two sides of the same coin who thrive on violence. They need each other to survive. Violence and censorship are never the answer, and anyone who tells you this is just wrong. In fact, as President Barack Obama once said in an address to the United Nations General Assembly, efforts to restrict speech can quickly become a tool to silence critics and oppress minorities. The strongest weapon against hateful speech is not repression, it is more speech. The voices of tolerance that rally against bigotry and blasphemy and lift up the values of understanding and mutual respect. If we want to build a better society and rid ourselves of extremist movements like Antifa and the alt-right, then we must embrace that which made the United States one of the greatest country, actually the greatest country in the world. And that is, we need to embrace freedom of speech and tolerance. Thank you. I appreciate you guys for having me on and talking about this important issue.
We're good to go. Okay, so we have a few questions brought to you by different students and people like that.
Sure.
So one of the first questions that we have is, what are your thoughts on what happened on January 6th at the Capitol?
It's very simple. I mean, it's they're pretty complex, actually. I don't know why I said they're simple. First of all, obviously it was wrong. I can't like it's ridiculous that people thought that they could overturn the election by storming the Capitol. That is not okay. They should have not done that. I was one of the first persons. As soon as I saw, they weren't even inside the Capitol when I noticed what was going on. Actually, no, that's not true. I know they were already inside the Capitol, but some of the first videos that I saw were of just some fighting outside with police, and I was very quick to condemn. It's like, no, this is not okay. Who the hell are we, Antifa? No. And then, of course, the violence started getting worse. Somebody was shot. Actually, a few people died, but one person was shot dead at the scene. And it just became very clear to me that this political violence is escalating. Now, there was a lot of people out there who said, oh, it was Antifa. They were disguised as Trump supporters. I'm like, no, they weren't. What, Antifa had like all of a sudden like thousands of people to go into the Capitol? Like, they do have numbers of that caliber, but it would have been a huge, massive thing to disguise thousands of Antifa supporters as Trump supporters. There would have been this huge organizing event, and there was no social media footprint. There was nothing to indicate that Antifa planned this beforehand. Later on, maybe a few hours later, or maybe the next day, I don't remember exactly when, I saw this flyer going on, being shared around by a lot of conservatives. That said, "Oh, look, Antifa was telling people to disguise themselves as Trump supporters to go to the Capitol." There is absolutely no evidence that that flyer originated before the event. My guess is that some random conservative wanted to pinpoint Antifa for the violence, and then they just throw it out there. That being said, I was talking to Andy No, who's a reporter from Portland, and I asked him about like, well, what's going on? What do you think about the January 6th events? And he said that a lot of the people that he interviewed, who either were part of the riot or maybe outside or support the riot in general, they said to him that they felt like they could get away with it because Antifa keeps getting away with doing the exact same thing. And in fact, I mean, they created riots right outside the White House a few months before that. And, you know, the media was saying like, oh, it's the police, it's bad. Like, no, like there was a bunch of rioters that are bad. And you know, one of the things that a lot of people forget is that on that same day in Portland, Oregon, you had the exact same thing. Antifa was rioting at federal buildings, and nobody was calling it insurrection. They're both riots. But yeah, there's a huge emphasis on January 6th. And of course it's wrong, but it's like the only example of violence that you truly have from like the right, when in fact you have countless examples from the left.
Perfect. Appreciate it. So the next question is, we know that you are a former Antifa member and you're very well outspoken against or the group now. So I guess a question from that is, do you receive any threats from Antifa or former people that you used to know since you have left?
I get a lot of hate mail and whatever. I don't really care. It's not the biggest deal. I will say though, no one from who I specifically knew. And the reason is because whenever I talk about these issues, people think that I was an Antifa like last year or like 2017 when it like people first heard about it. And no, I was around before I was even on Facebook. Like I was on MySpace, you know, like, and Facebook and Twitter wasn't really a thing at the time. And Facebook, well, it wasn't as great as an organizing tool as it is today. It was just kind of like the social media profile. You had friends, you talked to people, what was it called? You had your Facebook wall before it was called the timeline, you know? So I kind of left the movement and did all this stuff from 2011, 2012. I kind of left the movement at the end of December 2012, somewhere around there. And I started speaking about it in 2017. I really don't know what the heck happened to all these people that I used to talk to. I mean, it's been, at this point, it's been 10 years, you know? As a matter of fact, 2021, the first thing I did was in March of 2011. So it's legitimately been 10 years since I first put on that black mask, you know? I do get random people who will call me racist names. They'll say that I'm like a coconut. Have you ever heard that name? Like I'm brown on the outside, but white on the inside. I've also been called, what is the other one? It's an insult, but it doesn't make too much sense in English. When you call a Mexican that they have a cactus on their face, you're calling them a person who tries to be white, but you look native. And I've been called that. Anyways, but I mean, I get a bunch of hate mail from a bunch of random people, but it's been a long time, so I don't even know if they know what I'm up to.
So I guess kind of bouncing off of what you said, since you have left and you kind of were in it before Facebook and Twitter was a main tool. Another question that we did receive was, how did you communicate back then to other Antifa members or different things like that? And if you do know how they communicate now, then you're more than welcome to answer that as well.
Well, I remember just random story that came to my head. I remember one time I had one of my friends at the time. I went over to his house and he was a little older than me. He was like, I want to say 19, 20. I don't remember exactly how old he was. He was like about 3 years older than me, maybe 2 years older than me. Don't remember quite much. And I remember that I had his number, you know, and I could text him and I could call him, but it was something kind of serious that I wanted to talk to him about. We were supposed to do this activism project, but I was like, I went to his house and tried to talk to him in person, and somebody who lived with him, they said, oh, like, he's not home, you know, you want me to call him? And I'm like, no, you know, I don't want there to be a record of this. And I'm thinking to myself, and I left him a note, which is funny because as soon as I finished writing the note, he actually came home. Back then, we used to call each other and kind of talk in person. There was a lot of in-person recruitment or calls to action. Also, if you ever go to a left-wing music shop or comic book shop or bookshop, all these different things, you'll often see different calls to action flyers, you know, like an event flyer saying, oh, meet up here. And that's kind of how you used to meet a lot of people. Like back then, you would show up to an event, you'd meet people, then invite you to more, you know? I mean, that's how I got my start. Modernly, I've noticed that there is a open call for violence everywhere. One example is the Young Democratic Socialist in Minnesota. I forget, it's a very specific chapter. It wasn't a national group. but one of the chapters was asking other people for help in order to take down a police precinct in Minneapolis. I can't remember which one. There's multiple in the city, but they were saying like, "Oh, bring your gear," and they implied, bring bricks, bring rocks, like gas masks, everything you would need to really face off against the police. Those are definitely much more effective because they are able to talk to the broad audience instead of just random people who used to go to the music shops and in general. And I'm very certain that is very similar to what I had. Once you show up and you meet people and then you start getting connected with others. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the next question, I guess that answered very well, by the way, is we have a student that is interested in going into law enforcement.
Sure.
And they would like to know what needs to be done by the police about Antifa.
You know something? I think that the police is doing a pretty good job at at trying to take down Antifa. I actually have very few criticisms for the police. You can look at specific examples of maybe the police should have done this, should have done that. But in general, I mean, they're going out there and arresting people. They're getting probable cause. They're arresting them, the due process, everything, the whole by the books. Law enforcement is not the problem when dealing with Antifa. The problem are prosecutors. There's a lot of left-wing prosecutors who either agree or sympathize with the Antifa ethos, their mission. And guess what happens? They get arrested. Some of the Antifa activists, so-called activists, they get arrested. They get booked. A prosecutor looks at their case and be like, nah, it was the police overreach. Dismissed. And you'll have legitimately people who keep getting in and out of jail and they can't do anything about it because the prosecutors will not file charges, even though it would be an easy victory for them, which just shows you that it's very politically motivated. There's this guy, and I think he might have been in Illinois or Wisconsin. I can't remember. It was a few months ago. It was in January, definitely in January, where, again, he had been in and out of jail like 4, maybe even 5 different times. And he, for different destruction of property. And the prosecutors, they were like, nah, he's not really a threat. We're not going to bore you with him. Well, guess what happened? He was at an event that turned violent, and you can see it in video. There was the police had a video camera and like documented everything as they typically do from a top building. He pulled out a knife and stabbed someone. You won't hear that in the mainstream media. Another example, which actually hits pretty close to home, if you guys remember who Hayden Williams is, he's the kid who got punched in the face at UC Berkeley. Well, he worked for me at the time. And I remember that when he got punched in the face, that's a whole different story, actually. But, I sometimes ask him, is like, hey, are they going to, like, prosecute Zach? Because there's charges. There's charges are still filed. No one's dropped them yet. But what's going to happen, right? For several months, actually for over a year, I kept asking every so often, have you heard anything? What's going on? And the prosecutor told them, I'm not going to do this because it was just some, playground fight. It's not a big deal. I'm like, no, look at the video. The video was very clear that Zach instigated a violent action against Hayden without provocation. Well, guess what happened about a year and a half later? He stabbed someone else in a different county. Now he's facing attempted murder charges. The key to fighting against Antifa is not law enforcement. They're doing a pretty darn good job because they have experience with extremist groups. They're doing okay. The problem are prosecutors who are refusing to bring charges, and they are very politically motivated.
Appreciate it. So I guess the next question is, have you ever received any funding from anyone as an Antifa member? So I guess
No.
being paid by a group or a specific person.
No, there's this meme out there that Antifa gets paid by George Soros, and it's not true. And it actually reveals a very dangerous thought. And it's the fact that there's people out there who are not doing this for money. They're doing this out of their hearts. That's incredibly dangerous. There's some people who hate the United States and who hate the GOP and Democrats alike because that's what they believe. No one's paying them. And it's very dangerous to believe this meme that, oh, George Soros is just kind of paying them, that's what's going on. Like, no. There are people out there who are willing to hurt you because that's what they believe.
Yeah. I guess just a couple more is, what would you say to individuals calling for Antifa as an idea rather than an organization or, like you said earlier, a movement or different things like that?
It's incredibly hard to pin down Antifa because it's actually, I was talking to a friend of mine who was also a former member of the anti-fascist movement. I mean, he was around about 10 years before me, 2001 to 2004 or 5. And it's kind of wild because we were having a conversation about like what Antifa really is. And one of he brought up that one of its hallmarks is the fact that it thrives on being complex and hard to understand, because at the same time they can be like, we're the anti-fascist movement, we're here fighting fascists, but then they'll say, but we don't exist, you know. Yeah, it's the funniest thing, and you'll hear this doublespeak, and even in mainstream figures. There was a guy from the Biden administration going on I think it might have been MSNBC or CNN just like last week, and he said, you know, like anti-fascist movement, it's not a terrorist organization, it's just an idea, you know, again promoting that lie. Well, like a couple sentences later, he said, well, if they're fighting anybody, they're fighting fascists. So if you're anti-Antifa, guess what? You're canceling out Antifa. So you're just fascist. You know, it's kind of ridiculous. The best way to talk to people who just say that it's just an idea, point at specific examples. Don't say Antifa like, oh, Antifa did this. Look at who's on the ground. In San Francisco, talk about the 161 crew. In Berkeley, talk about BAM. In certain cities, they always have a different name that doesn't go by the Antifa name, but are all part of that family. And now you can't deny the fact that those groups exist because they have a banner, they have meetings, they have organizations, or they have a more traditional organizing.
Yeah. So kind of off of what you were saying earlier about since you did know people personally within Antifa and stuff like that, we have a question that kind of relates to that is, does Antifa resemble a social club at all? And do the members, I guess, hang out or meet outside of whenever they are specifically protesting or different things like that?
It's weird for me to say that I was part of this movement because I never saw myself as part of like Antifa. Of course, we had the banner, we had the name, we had the ideas, but most people don't really see themselves as like, I am an Antifa. It's not like I had to apply to be part of Antifa and all of a sudden I got a rejection letter or whatever. I'm sure that a lot of you guys you applied to Liberty University and then you were very excited to hear back. That's not how it works at all. In fact, the things that I did eventually it was just with my friends. You know, we were out there, we'd hang out, and then I remember one time we were literally, and this is actually one of the things that I am kind of proud about. And I absolutely hate sobriety checkpoints. I think that they're a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and they should be. And I think the Supreme Court got it wrong when they said that they were allowed. But nonetheless, I remember one time we were just hanging out, and then we drove to get Mexican food, and then we saw a checkpoint, and we were like, "What the heck?" Then we came back about 20 minutes later with flyers warning people of like not to drive through there so they could drive around and stuff. That's kind of some of the activism stuff that's actual activism and stuff, but that's some of the actions that we did. We literally would be hanging around, would think, well, we should do something about this. Let's go out there and do it. Most often, though, we would join some of the larger organizations. We were part of the Occupy protests. We were part of the neo-Nazi things where it wasn't just us. There was numerous different Antifa groups or anarchist groups from throughout Southern California. But yeah, very brief, though, to answer that question. They were my friends, you know. We did a lot of things together, and we also did activism, or as we saw it.
Yeah. So one of the final questions, I'll ask you one more after this, but during your time in Antifa, I guess the question is saying, what did you want to accomplish? What was your goal as being a part of Antifa?
I absolutely hated banks, and to this day, I hate banks. You know, it's actually kind of interesting because the more I talk about these issues, I notice that I still believe very much the same things. It's just that I've realized that my beliefs are not well served by the anti-fascist movement. I'm still very much anti-war. I've always been Second Amendment, pro-Second Amendment. I've always hated banks. I think that they're, as Thomas Jefferson said, paraphrase, I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said they're one of the most dangerous threats to the United States or to the country. You know, I still believe a lot of these things, but it made me realize that the anti-fascist movement wasn't the best vehicle to promote my beliefs. I am so sorry. I went off track for a second. What was the question again?
Asking, what did you want to accomplish?
That's right. What I want to accomplish. So again, some of my goals, I wanted to, when we were at the Occupy protest, I remember that I did an interview with, there was this meme out there that said, oh, the Occupy protests they don't even know what they want. And it was everywhere. I gave an interview to Canal 22, which is a Spanish-speaking network over there. I was wearing the black mask, which sucks because I really wish I could find that interview. Like I'd be like, yeah, I was right there. Anyways, and they asked me, well, what are you trying to accomplish? And I said, well, you know something, we want to bring attention to the banks because the banks are trying to squeeze the life out of working Americans and working people. And I think, in fact, I just remembered, I quoted Thomas Jefferson then too. I just thinking like how, that was one thing. Anything that kind of seemed like it was being oppressive to people, we wanted to bring down, whether it be banks, whether it be like the federal government, the police, neo-Nazi groups, or whatever. That's actually why they see some of these groups as fascists. They see immigration, ICE. They're not just enforcing laws and trying to make sure that criminals are out. They're hurting families, and according to their logic, they're hurting families. They're separating families or whatever, which is an injustice. And sure, we can have a discussion about whether it's an injustice, whether things are appropriate, but they go from like 0 to 60 and trying to abolish the system. And then when you ask them, what would you replace it with? They will say nothing or whatever. And well, you're kind of screwing people over if you have nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess one of the final questions that we'll just kind of wrap up with, is asking, you said that you were proud that you never really hurt anybody in Antifa. You never were violent per se to other people for your beliefs or anything like that. But you said you did do a little bit of vandalism, different things like that. Did you ever have an encounter with police, say arrested or detained or anything like that?
I was arrested once, but surprisingly, I was arrested when I was a libertarian, not when I was in the anti-fascist movement. If you guys want to read that story, it's in my book. And I was held, it sucked. It really sucked. I'll tell you that story. I got arrested for a sobriety checkpoint. I don't drink. I don't do drugs. In fact, I've never touched anything like that. People think I'm Mormon because I don't drink coffee either, and I got married when I was really young. But the reason that I got arrested is because I drove through a DUI checkpoint when I was 19, and I pulled down my window, and the officer asked me for an ID, and I was like, "You got probable cause?" Pulled me out of my car, got arrested, whatever. I cannot believe that I got away with so much. And then when I thought I was right on the law, I got arrested. You guys can read that story in my book if you guys get it. Anyways, I mean, I had some encounters with the police, but I wasn't the most outrageous or the most out there. I was there. I tried protecting my friends and trying to do things here and there, but no. I remember one time I was on top of a statue in Pomona, California at an anti-neo-Nazi rally, and I remember a police officer was demanding that we get down. I complied because it was only a few people at the time. It was very early in the protest. There's other times where I remember, again, in the Pomona event, that the police was, we rushed the neo-Nazis. Eventually, we were like right face to face with them, and then the police created this division or this scrimmage line between us with horses, and then they started pushing us back or whatever. There's actually a video out there of that encounter and stuff. But again, I got away with a lot of things. Never got arrested. Never did that. At least when I was part of that movement.
Oh, we appreciate it.
Thank you.
So I just kind of want to say thank you again for being willing to come. We appreciate it. Unfortunately, we couldn't have the event in person. I know it would have been much more amazing in person, but we are grateful that you still were able to come. So we do want to encourage any of the students that are watching to come get Gabe's book. We are going to be giving away some. But yeah, I mean, if you have any closing remarks or anything like that, you're more than welcome to close us out.
Well, thank you. I appreciate everybody who came here. Obviously, we had a small audience because of COVID restrictions. If anyone's out there in the live stream, please be sure to come out here. If you guys have a question for me personally, I'll be more than happy to give you a few minutes to talk about it. You know, even if you're a liberal or whatever you believe, I'm more than happy to talk to you about my experiences. And as he mentioned, we are giving a few copies. I'm not sure how many copies
I
or
believe
whatever.
around 10 or so.
About 10 or so. So the first 10 people who come, they'll get a free copy from me autographed. And yeah, but thank you. I appreciate everybody who's in the live stream as well as everybody who attended in person. Thank you.